Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It was a few minutes past 5 o'clock in the morning on April the 16th, 1906, and Henry James was lying in bed trying to get to sleep. At that time he was 64 years old and he suffered from two debilitating diseases. He had gout and he had angina, which was the result of an enlarged heart, which he acquired by numerous long and vigorous hikes in the mountains, which he refused to eliminate from his agenda.
What a fool.
Thank you, Roshi. His bed was located at that time on the campus of Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, where he had spent the academic year, as he put it, trying to put Stanford on the map in the world of philosophy.
Tyson, did you say Henry James?
No, William James.
What? Yeah, I think you said Henry James.
Did I?
Yeah,
Well, they're very different people.
very different. Even the brothers, though, right?
Well, he had spent the previous year teaching at Stanford and had spent most of that year without sleep, actually. He had this was an ongoing problem for him. But on this particular moment, on this particular morning, it was interrupted suddenly by his bed moving back and forth. He later described it like a rat, like a dog shaking a rat.
Oh.
It was the beginning of the San Francisco earthquake, which he recognized immediately and tried to get out of bed, but he was incapable of standing up, actually. But he greeted this event not with the trepidation and fear which most of us would, but with glee. Let me read what his biographers had to say about this. The thing was over in 48 seconds. James's first unthinking response to the quake was, he tells us, one of glee, admiration, delight, and welcome. He felt, he said, no sense of fear whatever. Go it, I almost cried aloud, and go it stronger. Well, that earthquake did go it stronger. It collapsed 14 buildings on the campus of Stanford University. It killed I don't know how many thousands of people.
In 48 seconds, or was this?
And
Tyson, John Muir had the same response
really,
to an earthquake. You ran out of the house shouting, an earthquake, a glorious earthquake. Another madman.
well, I think that's the reason I brought this up is because William James was an extremely exuberant character. And when he got into something, he did it 100%. And it didn't matter whether it was a good endeavor or what turns out to be a bad endeavor. He got thoroughly into it. And I always think of this particular incident as a great example of embracing change. He had a remarkable facility in that direction, and I think it sets a great example for all of us. You know, impermanence in this world is a given. It's one of the three marks of existence. The other two being suffering and no self. But all of us, most of us, to some degree or another, resist change. And many of us end up wishing that circumstances were different from what they are. Shakyamuni had a parable about this, which is usually referred to as the second arrow. The first arrow occurs when you are physically hurt by change. The second arrow occurs when you try to resist it. And for the most part, the second arrow is more painful than the first. Well, I read this recently. I read this about William James recently, and of course I wanted to find out about the circumstances surrounding his death, because there's no greater change than death. And I recently came across a book that was written by Simon Critchley, who was a professor of philosophy at the New School in New York City, and also works for the New York Times. He does the opinionator column in the opinion pages of the New York Times. And he wrote a book recently. I love the title of this book. It's called The Book of Dead Philosophers. And he starts off by saying that it is his opinion that how you die is far more important than how you live. And so this book is a compendium of about 200 philosophers and the circumstances surrounding their death.
Oh my heavens.
Important to who?
To him.
Okay.
You know, it'll become important to you too. As it is to me.
Yes.
That we got.
So, I learned that he died in the arms of his wife, Alice, 4 years after the San Francisco earthquake, and from complications arising from his heart problems. And he requested that his wife rejoice in the arrival of his death, and that he was going to be just fine. The equanimity with which he approached this event had even been noticed by no lesser a person than Sigmund Freud. William James and Sigmund Freud had one meeting before James died, And that occurred when Freud came to the United States to present 3 papers at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was an international symposium on psychology. It was the first international symposium on psychology. And Freud had elected to attend, and he brought along with him a young man who he had just recently met and acquired as a student, and that was Carl Jung. Freud at this symposium was, I think, about 53 years old, and Carl Jung was 34, so 19 years younger. And of course, when William James decided he was unsure as to whether he wanted to go to this or not. This was barely 1 year before he died. He wasn't feeling too well. But he had heard all sorts of things about Sigmund Freud, so he decided to go see, as he said, what the hubbub was about. And he wanted to listen to Freud present his 3 papers. They had several encounters, and they were not very well recorded. I mean, this, to me, is a great historical significance, because Sigmund Freud, of course, is the man who gave us the unconscious, and William James is the man who gave us consciousness. But as a matter of fact, as it turned out, William James got along much better with Carl Jung than he did with Sigmund Freud. But after the symposium was over, he got back on the train to go back to Boston, and he walked to the station with Sigmund Freud, and they started a conversation on the subject of consciousness. And then he suffered an attack of angina and had to sit down. And Freud continued on to the station with his suitcase to put it on the tray. And that was the extent of their encounter. Scarcely 100 years after the San Francisco earthquake, 98 years to be exact, there was another seismic event in the year 2004 that we are all very familiar with. And that was the earthquake and the subsequent tsunami in Indonesia, which killed 230,000 people. We just celebrated, if you want to use that word, celebrate, commemorated the 10th anniversary of that event, of that earthquake. And in the winter issue of Tricycle magazine, a woman wrote an article who had helped with the recovery of that earthquake and tsunami. And she described her experiences doing that. Her name is Ruth Kabatsnik. She was a psychologist who lended her efforts to the survivors to see if she could be of any help. What she ended up doing, actually, was conducting relatives and survivors through the limitless lines of corpses and body parts that had been collected in the hopes of identifying those corpses and body parts. She said that for her it was a ghastly endeavor. But she talked about people's attitudes as she conducted them on this tour, and she talked about the fact that she noticed that that there were a considerable number of Americans who died in the tsunami. It was Christmas time. They were there on vacation, and a great number of the people who were killed were actually foreigners. And she noticed that there was a great difference between the way the indigenous survivors conducted themselves as opposed to the way the Europeans and the Americans conducted themselves. And she made a distinction. The Indonesians and the Thais made a distinction between what they called people with a yayin, which is a cool heart, and those who had a yayon, a hot heart. The indigenous survivors tended to be rather calm and collected as they went looking for their loved ones. They were emotionally much more collected than the Europeans were generally pissed off. As she describes it, they were betrayed by the circumstances and by the experts who didn't detect the tsunami in time to issue warnings. And parents blamed themselves for not protecting their children. Well, I brought this up because I think it affords an interesting contrast to the way that William James went at this problem, and the way the survivors, the European survivors anyway, conducted themselves. It's interesting that William James, about 3 weeks after his earthquake, sat down and wrote a little essay about it and described what he did. Almost immediately after the event, he and one of his students went into San Francisco to try to find the student's relatives, and found them. But there was no mention made of any great despair or anger. Whereas in Indonesia, that seemed to be sort of commonplace. Reading this article put me in mind of what John Wellwood has written about befriending your emotions. You know, it is common in this culture to try to push them away, to treat our emotions in a dualistic way. Very often our reaction to an event like this is to make note of the fact that that what we are feeling doesn't necessarily accord with with our story. And because it doesn't accord with our story, or the way things should be, or the way I should feel, we try to suppress it, or we try to correct it in some way. And Wellwood, of course, points out that our effort to do this only results in a greater pain and a greater dissatisfaction. Wellwood talks a lot about befriending emotion. He talks about the ability to be in contact with your emotions and to feel your feelings without any reference to a storyline. And especially without any reference to judgment. It's kind of what we do when we practice mindfulness on the cushion. And only by coming in contact with your emotions with that kind of an attitude of complacency and an attitude of non-judgment, are we able to fully appreciate them. And in that way are we able to incorporate them into our lives. If we get angry at the anger, or if we get depressed at the sadness, we only compound the problem. William James had a view of the world that I would like to read to you. This was written by his biographer. He no longer believed, if he ever had, in a fixed world built on a solid foundation. The earthquake was for him a hint of the real condition of things, the real situation. The earthquake revealed a world, like James's own conception of consciousness, that was pure flux, having nothing stable, permanent, or absolute in it.
He had never encountered Buddhism, yeah? Did he ever, is there any notion that he might have encountered some form of Buddhism?
Yeah. I know that during the 1890s there was I cannot remember his name, but there was a gentleman from India who was a Buddhist who came to Harvard University and gave a series of lectures on Buddhism, which James attended. And I think he had some interest in. But of course, I don't think that he had any formal practice.
Right.
And I can't exactly remember the circumstances of those talks any longer. I know where they were given, and the reason I can remember that so easily is because I have sat in that lecture room, the very one. But I can't remember any more than that. Well, I wanted to bring this up because I think it affords a clear view of an enlightened mind versus one who suffers more than necessary. We we all have to find a way to embrace change. And I think that this is becoming more of a necessity than ever before. Does anybody have any other questions?
When we were at Mountain Center and there was an earthquake, tension Roshi reacted. He was delighted. He was outside watching the trees. He was happy as could be.
And we were-
I, on the other hand, was the opposite, the one you just described, suffering more. I was terrified.
And we were sitting, it was a big earthquake, I don't know what the magnitude was, but it was a big, we were sitting in the Zendo, which survived it just fine.
He built it, tension Roshi.
And among others, but he was the main person maybe. And as the earthquake hit, and there was that initial shock, which, as I said, was quite big. He said, I think it was him that said it, somebody said,
He did.
if you're facing a window, stand up, turn around, and sit back down. Which we did. Which we did. And Zazen went on.
It was the last morning of a 7.
Well, I've been in that Zendo, and those are big windows.
Yeah, they didn't break.
I don't think it made any difference whether you were facing them or
I
not.
thought about that later. If those shards of glass had come down into your back, it would have been pretty unpleasant. This was also an earthquake where I lost a great deal of credibility with my wife. Because we were walking up, the period came to an end, and it was the end of a
Session.
what was the end of session?
Yeah,
it was the end of
the last
session, that's
one.
right. Yeah, it was the last one.
morning.
We were walking out and she was quite frightened, and I said, don't worry, honey, there will be aftershocks, but they won't be as big as this one. At which point we were hit by an aftershock that was as big as that
I remember when that happened because Kathleen came into my shop after that happened.
Wide-eyed.
On Canyon Road, and she was pale then.
Still, I couldn't wait to get off the ground. All the way to the airport, the radio kept saying, there's a 50-50 chance of another big aftershock. Thanks.
If you live anywhere near the San Andreas Fault for any length of time, you sort of get conditioned to
Yeah,
some of the earthquakes.
there's that movie where they're having lunch and they all just pick up their
Right.
glasses while everything shakes.
Well, I experienced an earthquake. I had, my son was not yet a year, so I was young and recently married. We've been married about 2 years. I lived in Manila, Nicaragua. The whole city fell.
Where?
In Nicaragua.
Oh.
And I remember when we ran out the door and everybody was sitting on the ground. It was immediately followed by another one, and our car was like this. And we had aftershocks for 6 months,
Oh,
but big ones. And I didn't have this teaching or this practice,
under you.
and I never got used to the aftershocks. Yeah, but I think I could handle it a lot better now. Although I've been in little ones in Portland, and I still get very nervous after that experience.
Well, they said during the San Francisco quake that the largest sound was created by falling bricks
Yeah, chimneys.
because, of course, they didn't have any code back then. And a lot of the buildings, particularly on the Stanford campus, were made out of bricks. And William James was living in an apartment, and he was alone in his bedroom. He and his wife slept in separate bedrooms, but he didn't have a chimney come down on him. His glee may have changed somewhat.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever been hit by a brick, but it's not that.
I'd like to say one more thing about Mountain Center, that the buildings and the whole compound. Not only did it go through the Big Bear earthquake with relatively minor damage, but it also went through a recent, much more recent, forest fire, that destroyed everything around it for several square miles. And in the midst of this destruction was the Zendo, the buildings, the grounds. It survived. It was just, I wish I could have seen it. It was just a green island in the middle of this devastation.
But it was followed by severe flooding.
Yeah.
They really went. There were a lot of photos. Stacy posted a lot.
Yeah.
I saw that.
But both survivors had to do with attention to that building, and he had been ready for a fire. They'd cleared brush, and the materials and the equipment they needed to deal with sparks and embers. And he thinks that the firefighters were particularly attentive to the Zendo because it was clear that he had done so much himself, and the rest of the Sangha had done so much to prepare it for a fire, whereas of course you can imagine what was the condition of most buildings and grounds.
Right.
One thing you do learn is that you never take your Mother Earth for granted.
You never what?
Never take your Mother Earth for granted.
I was in the San Francisco quake in 1960, and I did not know what was going on, except I just watched my bowl of soup go all the way across the table and fall on the floor.
Well, thanks.